lots of stereotypes that float around about the Middle Ages. And one of them is that people forgot how to read and write. And that the only people who remembered how to read and write were people in the church and monks. So you've got this image of monks sitting in their dark rooms by candlelight, scribbling away, preserving Western civilization because they're the only ones who know how to write it down. Well, there were a group of us that started talking to each other at conferences and saying, you know, I'm not sure that's quite right, because I've got this little piece of evidence over here that says ordinary people, some of them knew how to read and write too. And so we decided to get all of our bits and pieces together and compare them. And it took us several years. We met for 5 or 6 years before we decided to write a book about this. And it was really a jointly written book. We sat down in a room and compared pieces and really put it together as a whole. And the conclusion we came to was that this image that only churchmen could read and write stems mainly from the fact that most of our sources, the written material that survives from the period, all comes from churches and monasteries. And the reason for that is simple. Churches and monasteries are the only institutions that survive from the period. So it's their archives that we have. But if you look in the cracks, if you look for single references, if you look, for example, at an account of a dispute that says Jim and Bob were fighting over property, and they go to a court, and Bob brings a document that says it's his property. Whoops, that's evidence that Bob knew something about documents. If you go to Spain, I forget how many years ago, a farmer was digging in his field and found pieces of slate, rock, with scratchings on it. And they deciphered the scratchings, and it turns out they were property records. People were using slate as paper. Never would have figured that out if the archaeologists hadn't dug it up. The same thing with wooden tablets in North Africa. Okay. Every once in a while in Europe, a church would get hold of somebody's property, and the person that sold it to them would give them all the documents. It's like you sell your house and you hand over all the records concerning the house. So in that one time and space, all of a sudden we've got a group of property records that have nothing to do with the church. They concern that property. So we put together a pretty powerful argument that no, all sorts of people could read and write in the early Middle Ages. And the impression that they couldn't is what we call an artifact of the source, that it's because of source survival that it looks that way. But if you look in the cracks and you put all the little tiny surviving pieces of evidence together, you get an image of a really different world. We were kind of proud of that, actually.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I have to ask you, when you present new arguments like that kind of go against, like you said, people have stereotypes of what happened. Is it something like that well received, or do you get a lot of pushback from, scholars and, readers as well?
In this case, we got a little bit of pushback, but not much. One of the reasons I'm so proud of this book is that it's had a big impact, and we've made a lot of people rethink how they understand literacy and the use of writing in the period. And the most important thing we've done is we've actually affected people who work in other periods. Because if you get somebody who works in the late Middle Ages or in the modern period, they'll just assume, oh, everybody did things in the early Middle Ages by speaking. You wanted to give somebody property, you get together and say, I, Bob, promise to give you this property, and let's shake hands. But after they've read our book, they can't assume that anymore. And it's changing how they're doing their work.